Blood doesn't smell like glory. It smells like old pennies and hot copper. When the iron strut tore through Ares' abdomen, he fully expected to die in the damp, sparking dark of the collapsed bulkhead. He didn't expect to be dragged bleeding before the sovereign of a star system. He certainly didn't expect her, a creature of elegant, fragile perfection, to stumble backward, her translucent skin turning the color of spoiled milk just because he stopped leaking. She looked at his scab like it was black magic. The pain didn't hit him first. It was the sound, a wet, fibrous tearing noise, like thick canvas being ripped apart in a silent room. Murray blinked. Dust coated his eyelashes, heavy and grey. The emergency klaxons of the transport vessel Archimedes were screaming, but they sounded distant, muffled by the ringing in his own ears. He tasted ash. He tasted grease. He tried to draw a breath, and that was when the pain finally caught up. It wasn't a sharp, clean ache. It was a brutal, blunt force pressure radiating from his right side, grinding against his ribs with every stuttering beat of his heart. He looked down. The main cabin's overhead lighting flickered, casting strobe light shadows across his lap. A jagged, rusted length of reinforced atmospheric piping protruded from his lower right abdomen. It had punched clean through his hazard suit, through the meat of his side, and pinned him to the decking. "Well," Erie rasped. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "That's inconvenient." He didn't panic. Panic was for people who had a chance of getting out. Erie was 38, grossly underpaid, and currently pinned like a biological specimen inside a ship that had just cratered into the capital plaza of a highly xenophobic alien homeworld. He rested his head back against the cold floor panels. Water, or maybe hydraulic fluid, dripped rhythmically on his forehead. A few feet away, Conrad Miller groaned. The ship's mechanic was sprawled over the navigation console, his leg bent at an angle that made Ares' stomach churn. "Conrad," Ares said. He swallowed. His throat was a desert. "You alive? Define alive," Conrad coughed, spitting a glob of something dark onto the cracked glass of the display. He shifted, hissed through his teeth, and rolled onto his good side. His eyes found Ares. He froze. "Jesus, Artie?" "Yeah, you're skewered." "Astute observation. Get the med kit." "I can't walk," Conrad said, his voice tightening with a sudden, raw edge of hysteria. "My femur's snapped, and you've got a literal pipe through your guts. We're dead. We're bleeding out on a rock 50 light-years from a decent pint." Ares closed his eyes. The smell of his own blood was beginning to overpower the scent of burning insulation. It was thick, metallic, and distinctly wrong in the sterile, ozone-heavy air of the crashed ship. He reached down with a shaking, grease-stained hand and touched the edge of the pipe. Wet heat. His fingers came away slick and crimson. He pressed his palm against the torn fabric of his suit, applying pressure. The agony flared, a white-hot spike that made him bite his lip until he tasted more copper. "Don't pull it out," Conrad warned from the shadows, his voice shaking. "If you pull it out, you'll uncap the pressure. You'll bleed to death in 2 minutes." "Wasn't planning on it," Ares grunted. He kept his hand pressed hard against the wound. His breathing was shallow. He could feel the slickness spreading beneath him, soaking into the mesh of his trousers. The body is a closed system. Break the seal and the machine stops working. He knew the biology. He just resented the reality of it. Then the hull groaned. It wasn't the sound of settling metal. It was the screech of heavy machinery tearing through the airlock. The Archimedes shuddered. Bright, blinding light spilled into the cabin as the primary blast doors were forcibly wrenched apart. Silhouettes stepped through the glare. They were tall, too tall, slender and rigid, moving with a stilted, fluid grace that made Ares think of praying mantises. The local authorities, the planetary guard of a species that had explicitly warned humanity to stay out of their airspace. Their armor was crystalline, catching the harsh light and fracturing it into prisms. "We surrender," Conrad yelled, his voice cracking. He raised his hands. "Medical emergency. We need a medic." The lead figure approached. As its eyes adjusted to the ship's gloom, Ares could see the intricate, almost glass-like structure of its face. They possessed a haunting, fragile beauty. Smooth, pale blue skin stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. No body hair. Large, pupil-less eyes that held the cold depth of a winter ocean. The translation matrices hardwired into the ship's comms crackled to life as the being spoke. "Trespassers," The voice was a synthesized, melodic hum. "Your vessel has violated the sovereign sanctity of the inner rings. You are to be detained and brought before Queen Eleanor." Aerie let out a short, wet laugh. "Eleanor? Really? That's the translation your software settled on?" The guard stepped closer, looking down at Aerie, its massive dark eyes locked onto the pipe protruding from Aerie's side. Then it looked at the pooling blood on the floor. The guard didn't look angry. It looked profoundly disturbed. It took a half-step back, its crystalline armor clinking softly. "You are structurally compromised. Your internal fluids are breaching." "I'm bleeding," Aerie corrected. His teeth gritted. "Need a cutter. Cut the pipe. Don't pull it." The guard signaled to two others. They didn't bring medical supplies. They brought a heavy thermal cutting torch. They looked at Aerie not with malice, but with the detached, slightly repulsed curiosity of someone watching a crushed insect twitch. In their world, Aerie knew from the briefings, biology was different. They were pressurized, pneumatic life forms. A puncture meant violent decompression or instant crystallization of their vital sap. They didn't bleed, they shattered. To them, a creature sitting upright with a hole in its midsection, leaking gallons of red fluid, was an impossibility. It was a walking corpse. "Hold still," the guard murmured, aiming the torch. "If you cook my liver," Aerie ground out, sweat stinging his eyes. "I'm going to haunt you." The torch flared. The heat was immediate and suffocating. Aerie smelled scorching metal and singed flesh. He screamed, entirely against his will, a raw, ugly sound that tore his throat. The metal snapped. Before he could catch his breath, two pairs of long, cold hands grabbed his arms and hoisted him up. The agony was blinding. The world tilted, dissolved into static, and went black. Aerie woke to the feeling of cold, polished stone against his cheek. His vision swam, slowly resolving into sharp, geometric lines. He was lying on a floor of seamless white marble, veined with a faint, luminescent gold. The air here was perfectly still, devoid of dust, smelling faintly of ozone and crushed flowers. It was a sterile, unforgiving kind of beauty. He tried to push himself up, but his right arm gave out. He collapsed back onto the stone with a heavy thud. "Don't move, you idiot!" Aerie turned his head. Conrad was slumped against a towering alabaster pillar a few yards away. His leg was crudely splintered with what looked like pieces of their own ship's paneling. Conrad's face was bruised, his uniform torn, but he was watching Aerie with a mix of relief and stark terror. "Where are we?" Aerie whispered. Every syllable required a conscious effort of his abdominal muscles. It felt like a rusted knife was twisting in his gut. "The palace," Conrad muttered, glancing nervously around the vast, echoing chamber. "They dragged us out of the wreckage, left the dead, brought us here. They think you're dying, Artie. Hell, I think you're dying. You've been out for 2 hours. Aerie looked down. The pipe was still there, a jagged metal stump protruding a few inches from his belly. His hazard suit was ruined, soaked in a heavy, dark crust. A fresh wave of nausea washed over him. The wetness beneath him was sticky. Blood. He was still losing it, though the flow seemed sluggish. "Good to know," Aerie rasped. He reached a trembling hand to his side. His fingers met the thick, tacky resistance of half-coagulated blood. It was a mess, a grotesque, wet, human mess in the middle of their pristine, perfect architecture. A resonant chime echoed through the chamber, vibrating in Aerie's teeth. At the far end of the hall, a massive set of geometric doors slid open in absolute silence. A procession entered. They were tall, moving in perfect, unbroken unison. In the center walked the sovereign. Aerie didn't need the translation matrix to know who she was. She radiated authority. She was taller than the rest, her skin a translucent, pearlescent shade of white. She wore garments that looked like spun glass and liquid silver, draping over her severe, angular frame. Her eyes were deep, fathomless voids of obsidian. Queen Eleanor. The translated name felt ridiculous against the terrifying alien presence she commanded. The guards flanking the room struck the butts of their energy rifles against the floor. The sound was sharp, final. Eleanor stopped a dozen paces from Aerie. She looked down at him. Aerie forced himself to look back. He was lying in a growing puddle of his own making, his skin pale, his lips cracked and dry. He knew exactly what he looked like. He looked like roadkill. "These are the trespassers," one of the guards stated, its synthetic voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "The vessel was destroyed. These two remained functional, though one is currently draining." Eleanor tilted her head. The movement was bird-like, abrupt. "Draining. It is leaking its core fluid." "Yes, Sovereign. The structural breach is severe. We extracted the debris, but left the primary impalement to prevent immediate hydrostatic collapse. It will expire shortly." Airy coughed. It was a wet, ragged sound. A fresh line of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. "Reports of my death," he wheezed, fighting the darkness encroaching on the edges of his vision, "are greatly exaggerated." Eleanor's obsidian eyes narrowed. She stepped closer. The delicate hem of her silver garments brushed the polished floor. She stopped just short of the dark stains spreading from Ares' body. She looked at the blood. She looked at the jagged pipe. "You are conversing," Eleanor said. The translation earpiece in Ares' ear rendered her voice as a cool, aristocratic tenor, but he could hear the underlying acoustic trill of her actual speech. It sounded like shattering ice. "Your primary containment is breached. Your vital fluids are exposed to the atmosphere. Why are you not paralyzed by the pressure differential?" "Because," Ari grunted, bracing his left hand against the floor and forcing himself agonizingly into a half-sitting position. The room spun wildly. Conrad hissed a warning, but Ari ignored him. "I'm not a balloon, Your Majesty." He was breathing hard now. The pain was a living thing, chewing on his nerve endings. The alien court watched him in absolute horrified silence. To them, the human body was a nightmare. It was soft, porous, asymmetrical, and entirely too resilient. "Your fluid is oxidizing," Eleanor noted, her tone shifting from commanding to deeply unsettled. She pointed a long, slender finger at the dark crust forming on his suit. "It is turning black. The rot has set in. You are decaying while you still possess consciousness." Ari looked at his side. He let out a breathless, exhausted chuckle. "That's not rot. It's a scab." "A scab?" The translation matrix seemed to struggle with the concept, relaying the word with a tone of utter confusion. "Yeah, it clots, plugs the hole." Ares shifted his weight. A sharp, localized pain flared. He realized a secondary shard of metal from the bulkhead, no bigger than a finger, was embedded just above the main pipe. It was shallow, but it was pinching a nerve every time he moved. He didn't think about it. He just reacted. His patience was gone. His politeness had died in the crash. Ari gripped the small, jagged shard of metal with two blood-slicked fingers. He gritted his teeth, inhaled sharply, and yanked it out. The wet schlick of the metal leaving flesh echoed in the silent chamber. Ari groaned, dropping the bloody shard onto the pristine white marble. It landed with a dull clink. A fresh, bright red stream of blood welled up from the secondary puncture wound, trickling down his side to join the larger mess. Around the room, the reaction was instantaneous. 3 guards took a synchronized step backward, their energy rifles dipping. Conrad buried his face in his hands, muttering a steady stream of curses. But it was Queen Eleanor's reaction that commanded the room. The sovereign of the Ethelgard system, a being whose species viewed physical trauma as a mathematical certainty of death, who understood biology only in terms of perfect pressurized equilibrium, physically recoiled. The pearlescent, translucent skin of her face shifted. The subtle, bioluminescent blue hues beneath her cheeks rapidly faded, leaving her looking hollow, like bleached bone. She went visibly pale. Her obsidian eyes widened, fixing on the fresh blood welling from Ares' side. "You?" Eleanor's voice was no longer cool. The synthesized translation couldn't hide the raw acoustic stutter of her terror. "You removed a structural obstruction from an active breach. Willingly." "It was pinching," Ari breathed, pressing his hand over the new wound. His palm was hot. He applied heavy, punishing pressure. The pain was blinding, but he welcomed it over the dizzying numbness. "Needed it out." Eleanor stared at him. She stared at his hand, pressing into his own torn flesh. "Your fluid, it is spilling out. You are accelerating your own demise for the sake of localized discomfort." "I'm not dying," Ares snapped, though his fading voice betrayed him. He glared up at her, the cynicism he usually reserved for bureaucratic dispatchers bleeding into his tone. "I'm just leaking. Give it a minute." The entire court watched in morbid fascination. They did not intervene. To touch him would be to touch a walking plague, an anomaly of physics and nature. They waited for him to go into hydrostatic shock. They waited for his eyes to roll back, for the vital sap to drain entirely, for his organic machine to power down. Minute after minute passed. The only sound was Ares' ragged, wet breathing and the distant hum of the palace's environmental scrubbers. Ares slowly pulled his hand away from the secondary wound. The bright red flow had stopped. In its place, a thick, gelatinous, dark red mass had formed, sealing the edges of the jagged tear. The human body, stressed to its absolute limits, flooded with adrenaline and fibrinogen, was doing what it had evolved over millions of years to do: survive. The blood was thickening, hardening upon contact with the air. A scab. Eleanor stepped forward, her rigid composure breaking. She leaned down, ignoring the blood that stained the hem of her silver robes. She stared at the clotted wound. "It stopped," she whispered. "Yeah," Ares sighed, letting his head fall back against the cold stone. "Told you. The fluid, it changed state. It solidified to repair the breach." Eleanor looked from the dark, ugly mass on his skin up to his pale, sweat-drenched face. Her pale expression hadn't recovered. If anything, the horror had deepened into something entirely new: reverence and revulsion. "Your biology it is repairing itself in real time. Evolution's a bitch," Ares muttered. "Human," Eleanor said, the word feeling heavy and strange in her mouth. She stood up slowly, taking another step back. She looked at him not as a defeated trespasser, but as a monster, a creature that could be broken, pierced, and torn open, and yet refused to break, a creature whose very essence turned to mortar to hold the walls together. "This should be impossible. You are a creature of decay." "I'm a mechanic," Ares corrected, closing his eyes as a wave of exhaustion finally overtook the pain. "And I need a doctor or a sewing kit. Either works." Eleanor turned to her guards. The pale, bleached look on her face remained. "Bring the organic healers," she commanded, her voice trembling just enough to betray the absolute certainty she had lost. "Do not let it die. I must understand how the meat mends itself." As the guards scrambled, breaking their perfect discipline for the first time, Ares let the darkness take him. The stone was cold, but for the first time since the crash, he felt like he might actually wake up. Ares returned to consciousness not with a gasp, but with a slow, suffocating drag of air that tasted like bleach and artificial lilac. He didn't open his eyes right away. He catalogued his body first. The dull, grinding ache in his abdomen had sharpened into a hot, localized throbbing. The heavy, dead weight of the pipe was still there, pulling his skin taut. Beneath him, the surface was entirely wrong. It wasn't the unforgiving marble of the audience chamber, nor was it a mattress. It felt like smooth, tepid glass. It contoured slightly to his back, but offered no softness. He pried his eyes open. The light was a soft, shadowless blue that hurt his retinas. "Hey," a voice croaked to his left. Ares turned his head. The movement made the room tilt. Conrad was lying on a similar slab of frosted glass a few feet away. His injured leg was no longer splintered with ship debris. Instead, it was encased in a block of semi-transparent, pale blue crystal. It looked like ice, but no condensation pooled beneath it. Conrad looked exhausted, his skin gray under the alien lighting, but the manic panic in his eyes had dulled into a weary resignation. "They froze your leg?" Ares mumbled. His tongue felt like dry felt. "It's not ice," Conrad said, tapping the crystalline block with a grimy knuckle. It made a dull thwack. "It's warm. It's some kind of structural resin. The medics, if you can call them that, sprayed it on, said it would realign the internal lattice. They didn't even set the bone, Artie. They just encased it and let the resin do the pulling." Conrad shivered. "Felt like thousands of ants crawling under my skin for an hour." Ares grimaced, looking down at his own torso. They had cut away the rest of his ruined hazard suit, leaving him bare-chested. The rusted pipe jutted up toward the high, vaulted ceiling. Around the point of entry, the thick, blackish-red scab he had formed earlier remained untouched. He wasn't alone with Conrad. Standing on the opposite side of his glass slab was a group of 3 Ethel guardians. They wore garments of sterile white. Their tall, mantis-like frames hunched slightly as they observed him. They weren't using stethoscopes or monitors. They were passing a small, geometric prism over his body. The prism hummed, emitting a faint harmonic frequency that made Ares' teeth vibrate. Beyond them, separated by a floor-to-ceiling barrier of clear, sound-dampening glass, stood Queen Eleanor. She watched him with the unblinking intensity of a predatory bird. Her hands were clasped behind her back. "What are they doing?" Ares asked Conrad, not taking his eyes off the humming prism. "Trying to figure out how you work," Conrad said dryly. "They've been scanning you for an hour. They asked me where your secondary containment valves were. I tried to explain veins and arteries. I think I broke their translator." The lead alien, the caretaker, lowered the prism, its massive obsidian eyes fixed on Ares' face. "Consciousness re-established," the caretaker noted, the synthesized voice lacking Eleanor's aristocratic edge. It sounded purely clinical. "You possess a terrifying structural redundancy. Your core processor is functioning despite a massive drop in hydraulic pressure." "I need water," Ares rasped. The caretaker hesitated, then gestured with a long, spindly finger. Another attendant brought forward a shallow, crystalline bowl filled with clear liquid. They didn't hand it to him. They held it to his lips. Ares drank greedily. It wasn't water. It was slightly viscous, tasting of minerals and copper, but it coated his throat and settled his stomach. He coughed, wiping his mouth with the back of a shaking hand. "Now," Ares breathed, pointing a dirty finger at the metal protruding from his gut. "Take it out." The caretaker took a distinct step backward. The harmonic prism in its hand chimed a warning note. "Negative. The foreign cylinder is currently acting as a load-bearing plug. If we remove it, your internal cavity will depressurize. The clotted anomaly you formed will tear. You will resume draining." "Yes," Ares said, gritting his teeth as a spasm of pain rolled through his core. "I will bleed. That's what happens. You take it out. You stop the bleeding. You close the hole." "Close it?" The caretaker tilted its head. "Your casing is torn. We cannot simply fuse the organic mesh. You are not crystalline. If we apply binding heat, your flesh simply burns." "You don't melt me together," Ares growled, his patience evaporating. He was tired of being a science experiment. He was dying of sepsis on a glass table. "You sew it with a needle and thread. Or staples. Do you have staples?" The translation matrix fed the words into the alien's earpiece. The caretaker looked at Eleanor through the glass barrier. The queen pressed her hand against the partition, leaning closer. "Needle and thread," the caretaker repeated, the synthesizer struggling to inflect the sheer absurdity of the concept. "You wish for us to repeatedly puncture your outer casing with a metal shard, dragging a filament through the flesh to physically tie the breach together?" "Yes, that is barbaric. It introduces further microtrauma." "It holds the meat together until the meat heals itself," Ares snapped. He grabbed the side of the glass slab, knuckles turning white. "Listen to me. The pipe is rusted. My intestines are probably nicked. If you leave it in, microscopic organisms, bacteria, are going to multiply in my gut. I won't bleed out. I'll rot from the inside. Sepsis. It will take 3 days, and I will scream the entire time." The word rot caused a visible ripple of disgust among the alien medical staff. They possessed no immune systems because they possessed no bacteria. Their bodies were sterile, enclosed hydraulic systems. The concept of internal microscopic predators eating an organism alive was horrifying. Eleanor's voice crackled over the intercom built into the glass partition. It was cold, but laced with a morbid curiosity. "Do as the human instructs, caretaker. Extract the object. We will witness how the meat endures." There was no anesthesia. The Ethel Guardians didn't possess painkillers compatible with human neurochemistry. They offered a sonic dampener that was supposed to decouple his nerve impulses. But when they turned it on, Ares just felt like his teeth were exploding. He told them to shut it off. He was going to feel everything. Ares lay flat on the glass slab, sweat beaded on his forehead, pooling in the hollows of his collarbones. He asked for something to bite down on. They gave him a dense, rubbery block of sterile polymer. He clamped his teeth onto it. It tasted like nothing. The caretaker stood over him, holding a specialized extraction tool. It looked like a pair of silver tongs, terminating in a glowing, humming ring. "We will sever the external mass of the cylinder first," the caretaker stated. "Then, we will extract the remaining segment from your interior. Are your fluid replacement organs prepared for the shock?" "Just pull it," Airy mumbled around the block. The caretaker activated the humming ring. It passed cleanly through the iron pipe, about 2 inches above Airy's skin. The metal didn't spark, it just sheared away, the top half clattering to the floor. Airy barely felt the heat. Then came the hard part. The caretaker grasped the remaining stump of the pipe with the tongs. The alien's long, fragile-looking fingers were surprisingly strong. "Extracting," the synthesizer hummed. The caretaker pulled. Airy's vision whited out. A feral, muffled scream tore out of his throat, vibrating through the polymer block. It felt like a fishhook was buried in his spine, and someone was yanking it toward the ceiling. The rusted metal scraped against his torn abdominal muscles, catching on fibrous tissue and fat. The friction was a burning fire. He bucked against the table. 2 Ethel Guardian attendants immediately pressed their cold, hard hands against his shoulders, pinning him down. Their grip was like iron clamps. Sherlock, the sound was wet, heavy, and sickeningly loud in the sterile room. The pipe came free. A thick, dark geyser of blood followed it, arcing into the air and splattering across the caretaker's pristine white garments. The alien flinched violently, dropping the bloody stump of metal. It hit the floor with a heavy ring. Airy spit the block out. He was gasping, his chest heaving as his hands flew to the wound. Hot blood spilled over his fingers, pooling rapidly on his stomach and dripping down the sides of the glass slab. The pain was absolute, a blinding wall of static that threatened to pull him under. "Clamp it!" Airy roared, his voice breaking. "Pinch the bleeder!" The caretaker was staring at its blood-soaked robes, paralyzed. To its eyes, Airy was rapidly deflating. The core fluid was everywhere. It was a chaotic, horrific display of biological failure. "Do something!" Conrad yelled from his own slab, struggling against his crystal cast. "He's bleeding out!" Eleanor slammed her fist against the glass partition. "Caretaker, follow its instructions!" The alien snapped out of its stupor. It didn't have surgical clamps. It dropped to its knees, leaning over Airy's thrashing form, and plunged its bare, spindly fingers directly into the open, bleeding wound. Airy screamed again, a raw, ragged sound. The alien's fingers were ice cold. They rooted around blindly in the hot, wet mess of his abdomen. "Locate the primary flow," the caretaker muttered to itself, entirely abandoning the clinical detachment. "Pressure is dropping. Found a flexible tube. It is breached. Squeeze it," Airy gasped, his head rolling back. The room was growing dim. Black spots danced at the edge of his vision. "Just hold it tight." The alien pinched the severed artery. The heavy, pulsing flow of blood slowed, then stopped. Silence descended on the room, broken only by Airy's ragged, wet breathing. He was shaking violently, clinical shock. His skin was the color of old paper. The caretaker looked up, its hands buried deep in Airy's gut, its forearms slick with human blood. It looked at Eleanor through the glass. "The localized pressure tactic is functioning, but I cannot maintain this indefinitely. How do we seal the internal breach?" Airy forced his eyes open. He looked at the ceiling. "You don't have thread. Do you have glue? Cautery?" "We possess a vascular resin," the caretaker said, "used for sealing minor crystalline fractures in our young. It generates intense localized heat. Do it. It will fuse your flesh. The thermal damage will be extensive." "Better burn than dead," Ari wheezed. "Hurry." The caretaker signaled to an attendant. A small silver canister was brought over. The caretaker carefully shifted its grip inside Airy's abdomen, exposing the pinched artery. "Applying resin," the spray hissed. If the extraction was fire, the resin was a supernova. It smelled of burning hair, scorching meat, and chemical acridity. Airy's back arched off the table. He didn't scream this time. He couldn't draw enough breath. The agony punched the air from his lungs, locking his jaw so hard his teeth groaned. The alien pulled its hands free. The internal bleeding had stopped, replaced by a blackened, fused mass of tissue and pale blue resin. "Now the outer casing," the caretaker said, its voice trembling. It sprayed the resin directly into the gaping hole in Airy's stomach, filling the cavity and sealing the skin together in a thick, ugly, puckered scar of blue crystal and blackened flesh. Aerie collapsed back onto the glass slab. The fight drained out of him. His hands slipped off his stomach, falling limp to his sides. He lay there, a bruised, bloody, half-burned wreck of a human being in the center of their pristine alien medical ward. He stared at the ceiling, taking slow, stuttering breaths. Every inhalation pulled at the fresh, stiff resin in his gut, but the wet, heavy feeling of draining life was gone. He was sealed. He slowly turned his head to the side. Through the glass partition, Queen Eleanor stood absolutely still. Her hands were no longer behind her back. They were pressed flat against the glass. Her obsidian eyes traced the length of Aerie's battered body, lingering on the horrific, butchered state of his abdomen. She wasn't looking at him with disgust anymore. She was looking at him with an existential dread. She had watched a creature be violently disassembled, willingly subjected to torture, and chemically burned from the inside out, all to enforce its own survival. He hadn't just endured the damage, he had commanded it. Aerie met her gaze through the glass. His face was a mask of sweat, blood, and sheer exhaustion. The corner of his cracked lips twitched upward into a small, humorless, cynical smirk. "See?" Aerie whispered. He knew she couldn't hear him through the glass, but he knew she could read the shape of his mouth. "Told you I wouldn't die." Eleanor slowly took a step back from the partition. For the first time in her long, perfect reign, the sovereign of Ethelgard looked afraid. Time lost its meaning in the blue-lit, sterile ward. Aerie tracked the hours by the shifting tempo of his own pulse and the deep, radiating itch beneath the blue resin sealing his stomach. The pain hadn't vanished. It had simply relocated. The sharp, blinding spikes of the extraction were gone, replaced by a dull, suffocating heat that wrapped around his lower torso like a lead blanket. Every time he took a breath deeper than a shallow sip, the fused tissue and resin pulled tight, threatening to tear. He opened his eyes. The room was empty of the medical staff. Conrad was asleep or passed out, his head lolled to the side on the glass slab. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint rhythmic whir of the environmental scrubbers. Aerie looked down at himself. He was a disaster. The area around the blue resin patch had swollen, the skin puffing up tight and shiny, but it was the color that held his attention. A massive, horrific bruise was spreading across his abdomen and down his left flank. It wasn't just purple. It was an oil slick of trauma, deep, violent blacks at the center, fading into angry crimsons, sickly yellows, and a mottled, dead-looking green near the edges. His body was breaking down stagnant blood under the skin, a chemical cleanup crew working in overdrive. The heavy, geometric doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Queen Eleanor stepped into the room. She was alone, no guards flanking her, no caretaker hovering with a scanner. She moved with that same stilted, perfect grace, her silver garments whispering against the smooth floor. The scent of ozone and crushed flowers accompanied her, sharp and sterile, cutting through the lingering copper smell of Aerie's blood. She stopped beside his slab, looking down at his torso. She didn't look at his face. Her obsidian eyes were locked onto the spreading kaleidoscope of the bruise. "The rot continues," she said. Her acoustic voice trilled beneath the translated synthesizer, a sound like glass wind chimes caught in a draft. "Your outer casing is changing color. It is necrotizing." "It's a bruise," Aerie said. His voice was a dry croak. He swallowed, trying to find some moisture in his throat. "It's just trapped blood. White blood cells are breaking it down, reabsorbing it." Eleanor slowly raised her gaze to his face. "Reabsorbing. Your body consumes its own failures to clean the vessel. Something like that? Does it cause you agony?" "It aches," Aerie admitted, shifting his weight. A spike of heat shot through his gut. He flinched, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth. "But it means the meat is working. If it didn't hurt, I'd be worried." "Dead things don't hurt." Eleanor tilted her head. She reached out a long, spindly finger, hovering just an inch above the sickly yellow edge of the bruise. She didn't touch him. It was as if she expected the discoloration to leap from his skin to hers. "You are a paradox," she murmured. "We are Ethelgardian. We are grown in crystalline matrices. We are pressurized with vital sap, calibrated to exact atmospheric tolerances. If my arm is struck with sufficient force, It shatters. The sap crystallizes upon contact with the air. I would cease to function in seconds. We do not endure damage. We either exist in perfection or we do not exist. Aerie let out a slow, exhausted breath. Must make for short wars. We do not have wars, Eleanor replied, her tone chillingly flat. Conflict is mathematically illogical. When any physical alteration results in immediate death, we negotiate, we isolate, we eliminate from orbit. We do not engage in the tearing of vessels. She looked back at the jagged blue resin plug. Yet you were pierced. You were drained. You were burned from the inside out by chemical fire, and your biology simply altered its parameters to keep you conscious. Evolution, Aerie said, closing his eyes. Earth is a meat grinder. Gravity is heavy. The weather tries to kill us, and half the animals want to eat us. If we died every time we got a scratch, we wouldn't have made it out of the caves. We are built to take a beating. It is grotesque. It's survival. Aerie opened his eyes and locked onto hers. The cynicism was back, cutting through his exhaustion. You look at me and see a broken machine. I look at myself and see a successful repair job. It's ugly. It's going to scar. And I'm going to have a limp for a month, but I'm breathing. Eleanor withdrew her hand, clasping it behind her back. The caretaker believes you require organic sustenance, combustible matter to fuel this repair job. Our nutritional vapors will not suffice for your density. Yeah, I need food, real food, calories, protein, and water, a lot of water. I have ordered my botanists to synthesize a caloric paste based on your ship's databanks. It will be provided. She paused, her obsidian eyes narrowing slightly. Tell me, human, if we had not applied the burning resin, if we had simply left you in the chamber with the metal in your core, I would have bled out, Aerie said bluntly, or died of shock. We're tough, Your Majesty, but we aren't immortal. You lose enough blood, the engine seizes. Then you are mortal. It wasn't a question. It was a reassurance she was giving herself. You can be terminated. Aerie let out a dark, ragged chuckle that pulled painfully at his stomach. Oh, we die all the time. We're actually incredibly good at it. The trick is making sure the other guy dies first. Eleanor's expression tightened. The translucent, pearlescent glow of her skin seemed to dim. She took a step back, putting distance between herself and the bruised, battered creature on the table. You will rest, she commanded, the cold authority returning to her synthesized voice. We will observe your healing process. If your body truly rebuilds its torn infrastructure, it will redefine our understanding of organic limits. She turned and glided toward the doors. Hey, Aerie called out, his voice weak but sharp. Eleanor paused, looking back over her shoulder. If you're going to keep us as lab rats, Aerie said, pointing a finger at Conrad's sleeping form, fix his leg. A real fix, not just a block of ice. If you want to see how humans heal, you need to set the bones straight first. Eleanor stared at him for a long, silent moment. I will consider it. The caloric paste tasted like wet cardboard mixed with chalk, but Aerie ate every last drop of it. An attendant had brought it in a shallow grey bowl, holding it at arm's length, as if Aerie might lunge at them. He hadn't lunged. He had simply taken the bowl with trembling hands and forced the thick grey sludge down his throat. His stomach roiled, protesting the sudden influx of mass, but he kept it down through sheer, stubborn willpower. Conrad was awake now, picking miserably at his own bowl of paste. I think I chipped a tooth on a nutrient granule, Conrad muttered, poking his tongue against his cheek. He looked over at Aerie. You look like a corpse that got dragged behind a rover, Artie. Feel like one too, Aerie grunted. He set the empty bowl on the glass slab next to his hip. He stared at the ceiling. The dull blue lighting was starting to give him a migraine. His muscles were stiff, locking up from inactivity. The Ethel Guardians expected him to lie there until he was completely repaired. They didn't understand that for a human, immobility was its own kind of rot. If he didn't move, the scar tissue would bind tight, fusing his abdominal wall into a rigid, painful knot. He needed to stretch it. He needed gravity. I'm getting up, Aerie announced. Conrad stopped chewing. He stared at Aerie in horror. Are you out of your mind? You have a plug of alien superglue holding your intestines inside your body. If I stay flat, my back is going to seize, and the lungs will fill with fluid. Pneumonia. Eerie planted his elbows against the cold glass. Besides, I have to pee. Use the bed. They don't care. I am not pissing myself on a glass table while tall, translucent aliens take notes, Eerie growled. The physical mechanics of sitting up were a nightmare. Eerie couldn't use his core muscles. The moment he tried to flex his abdomen, the blue resin bit into his flesh like teeth. He had to rely entirely on his arms. He dragged his right leg to the edge of the slab, letting it drop over the side. The shift in weight pulled at his gut. Sweat instantly broke out on his forehead. He dug his palms into the glass, locking his elbows, and pushed. A ragged groan tore its way out of his throat. The room spun wildly, tilting at severe angles. His vision grayed around the edges. The blood draining from his head down to his legs felt like a physical weight pulling him into the floor. He sat on the edge of the slab, his chest heaving, his bare feet dangling inches from the polished ground. Through the glass partition, the caretaker and two guards suddenly materialized, their large black eyes wide with alarm. "Do not alter your orientation," the caretaker's voice barked through the intercom, loud and synthesized. "Your hydrostatic pressure is uncalibrated. Verticality will induce sudden fluid pooling." "I'm fine," Eerie wheezed. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles bone white. The massive bruise on his stomach looked even more grotesque in a seated position, folding and wrinkling around the blue resin plug. He looked down at the floor. It looked a mile away. He slid forward. His bare feet hit the cold, smooth tile. His knees instantly buckled. He caught himself against the edge of the glass slab, his shoulder slamming hard against the surface. The jar sent a shockwave of agony straight through his fused artery. He bit his lips so hard he tasted fresh blood, stifling the scream that wanted to come out. He hung there, breathing in short, harsh rasps, his arms shaking violently under his own weight. "Artie, sit down," Conrad pleaded, struggling against his crystal cast. "You're going to rip the seal." The heavy doors hissed open. Queen Eleanor strode in, flanked this time by 4 guards whose energy rifles were leveled directly at Eerie. "What is it doing?" Eleanor demanded, looking at the caretaker. "It is attempting self-locomotion," the caretaker replied, its voice bordering on frantic. "Against all structural logic, the internal gravity is tearing at its repaired breach." Eleanor turned her gaze to Eerie. He was hunched over, his forehead resting against the cold edge of the slab, his feet planted wide. He looked pathetic. He looked broken, but he was standing. "Human," Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the sterile room. "You are jeopardizing your own structural integrity. Return to the horizontal plane immediately." Eerie didn't look up right away. He focused on his breathing. Inhale, hold, exhale, don't throw up. Slowly, agonizingly, Eerie pushed himself off the table. He stood under his own power. He couldn't stand straight. He was hunched forward like an old man, his right hand gripping his side protectively, his left arm extended slightly for balance. He was swaying. He looked at the towering, flawless Queen of Ethelgard. "I need," Eerie panted, sweat dripping from his chin onto the floor, "to use a bathroom, a waste receptacle, whatever you call it." Eleanor stared at him. The rifles of her guards did not waver. She looked at his trembling legs, the sheer, violent effort it took for him simply to exist in a vertical space. "You are experiencing catastrophic pain," Eleanor observed. Her tone wasn't mocking. It was a cold, factual calculation. "Your neuromuscular system is misfiring. Your core is screaming at you to collapse. Why do you override it?" "Because," Eerie said, taking a tiny, shuffling step forward. The resin pulled. He winced, sucking air through his teeth. "If I let the pain win today, it's going to be twice as hard to beat it tomorrow." He took another step. It was a pathetic, shuffling gait, but to the aliens watching, it was a display of incomprehensible horror. A creature whose casing was pierced, whose internal fluids had spilled upon the floor, whose inner organs were chemically burned and glued together, was walking. It was defying the absolute mathematical laws of biology as they understood it. If an Ethelgardian had suffered a fraction of his trauma, they would be a pile of inert, crystalline dust. Eleanor raised a hand, gesturing for the guards to lower their weapons. The rifles dipped. She looked at Eerie not with the detached curiosity of a scientist, but with the profound, chilling realization of a monarch who had just discovered a new, terrifying variable in her universe. "Caretaker," Eleanor said softly, not taking her eyes off Aerie. "Yes, sovereign, provide the creature with a waste receptacle." Eleanor took a slow step backward, clearing the path for the limping, ruined human. "And reinforce the containment parameters of this wing. They are not merely resilient, caretaker. They are relentless. Healing is not a quiet process. It is a loud, itchy, violent internal war. By the fifth day, at least, what Aerie assumed was the fifth day, based on the artificial dimming of the blue lights, the maddening itch had begun. It started deep beneath the puckered seal of the blue resin, a crawling, electric sensation that made his fingers twitch. It was the feeling of a million microscopic nerve endings, frantically trying to find each other across a chasm of dead tissue. He lay on the glass slab, his teeth gritted, staring at the ceiling. He was sweating. The sterile, climate-controlled air of the ward felt stifling against his hot skin. "Stop scratching," Conrad muttered from across the room. "I'm not scratching," Aerie ground out, his hand hovering 2 inches above the fused ruin of his stomach. "I'm threatening it." Conrad was sitting up now, dangling his legs off the edge of his own slab. The Ethel Guardians had finally addressed the broken femur. True to their terrifying clinical efficiency, they hadn't used a cast. They had injected the localized area with a clear, humming fluid that rapidly calcified, bridging the gap in the bone in a matter of hours. The process had made Conrad vomit twice from the sheer metabolic drain. But now, the leg was straight, the muscle was heavily atrophied, hanging loose and weak, but the structural frame was solid. "It means it's knitting," Conrad said, gingerly rubbing his thigh. "My grandfather used to say an itchy wound is a waking wound." "Your grandfather didn't have alien floor sealant injected into his arteries," Aerie grunted. He pushed himself up. The physical mechanics of moving were getting easier. The blinding agony had downshifted into a dense, heavy stiffness. His abdominal wall felt like an over-tightened drumhead. Every time he stood, he had to consciously stretch the fused tissue, leaning back until he felt the internal pull stop just short of tearing. He lowered his feet to the floor. The cold tile was a welcome shock to his feverish skin. He stood, hunching forward out of habit, then forced himself to straighten up. The resin groaned. A dull throb radiated into his spine. He exhaled a long, shaky breath and began his daily laps. 10 paces to the glass partition, 10 paces back. He dragged his right foot slightly. The limp was a permanent fixture now, a result of the severed muscle fibers knitting together unevenly. The massive, colorful, oil-slick bruise had begun to fade into a sickly, jaundiced yellow, leaving the jagged mass of the blue resin as the focal point of his torso. As he reached the partition on his third lap, the geometric doors slid open. Queen Eleanor entered, moving with the silent, predatory glide that still made the hair on the back of Aerie's neck stand up. The caretaker followed a step behind her, holding the humming harmonic prism. Aerie stopped walking. He didn't retreat to his slab. He stood his ground, resting his weight heavily on his left leg, his chest rising and falling with shallow, guarded breaths. Eleanor stopped on the other side of the glass. She didn't speak. She just watched him. She had visited every day, observing his grotesque, stuttering progression from a dying organism to a functional, if damaged, machine. "Scan it," Eleanor commanded softly. The caretaker stepped up to the glass and activated the prism. The harmonic frequency vibrated in the air. The alien studied the holographic readout that projected from the device, its obsidian eyes blinking in rapid, disturbed succession. "The structural breach remains sealed," the caretaker reported, the synthesizer capturing a tone of profound disbelief. "The alien polymer we applied, it is no longer the primary load-bearing element. The organism's native tissue has grown over and through it. The density is—" The caretaker trailed off, tapping a long finger against the side of the prism. "Explain the density," Eleanor said, her voice sharp as cracked ice. "Where the native casing tore, it has not returned to its original state. The new connective fibers are arranged in a chaotic, cross-hatched pattern. It is not uniform, but it is thicker. It is structurally harder than the surrounding undamaged tissue." Eleanor tilted her head, her gaze boring through the glass, locking onto Aerie's battered abdomen. "It is reinforcing the compromised sector." "Yes, sovereign. The repaired area is less flexible, but it possesses a higher tensile strength than the original state. It has fortified the point of failure. Airy let out a dry, rasping laugh. The sound echoed harshly in the sterile room. It's called scar tissue. I told you we're built for the meat grinder. Eleanor pressed her palm against the glass. The bioluminescent glow beneath her pale skin pulsed, a rhythm of unease. In our architecture, a repaired fracture is always a point of weakness. It is a flaw that must be sheltered. You break, and your biology responds by building a thicker wall. It's ugly, Eri said, looking down at his own stomach. The resin was flaking at the edges, revealing thick, raised pink flesh underneath. It looked like a topographic map of a bad decision. And it pulls when it's cold, but yeah, it holds. A monument to trauma, Eleanor murmured. You carry your destruction on your surface. We call it experience. Airy stepped closer to the partition, leaning his shoulder against the glass. He was tired. The adrenaline was long gone, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion of a body that had spent 6 days fighting off the grave. Listen, I can walk. Conrad can stand. Your science experiment is over. When do we get off this rock? Eleanor didn't recoil from his proximity. She stared at the sweat beading on his forehead, the dark circles under his eyes, the grease and dirt that still clung to his hair. He was a creature of filth and decay, a walking biological hazard, and yet he possessed an aggressive, stubborn vitality that deeply unsettled her. Your vessel was obliterated in the atmospheric crash, Eleanor said, her voice flattening into a tone of absolute authority. However, my engineers have isolated an impounded sublight freighter from a previous incursion. It possesses an atmospheric seal and functional navigational thrusters. It is barely adequate for interstellar transit. I've flown worse, Airy said deadpan. The caretaker will guide you to the departure hangar at the onset of the next light cycle. Eleanor took a step back, her hands clasping behind her back. You will leave this system. You will not return. Your biology is an infection of chaos, human. It defies the order of Ethelgard. Don't worry, Ares sighed, pushing himself off the glass. The hospitality was great, but the food sucks. We won't be back. Eleanor turned to leave. Before she cleared the doorway, she stopped. She didn't look back at him. To endure is not the same as to thrive, Airy Murray, she said, the synthesizer rendering his full name with stiff precision. You celebrate your scars, but they are evidence of your fragility. They are proof that the universe can and will break you. Maybe, Airy replied, his voice raspy but steady, but it hasn't killed me yet. The walk to the hangar was an exercise in pure grinding misery. The Ethel Guardians had provided them with new clothing, loose-fitting garments made of a spun, synthetic polymer that felt like wearing cold silk. Airy hated it. It offered no warmth, no friction. It just slid over his sweaty skin, clinging uncomfortably to the raised edge of his abdominal scar. Conrad leaned heavily on a polished metal crutch the caretaker had fabricated. His calcified legs supported him, but his muscles trembled with every step. Airy walked beside him, his posture hunched, his right arm pressed firmly against his side. Every jarring step reverberated through his fused guts. They moved through the pristine corridors of the alien palace. It was a terrifyingly beautiful place. Vaulted ceilings of seamless alabaster, archways of frosted glass, wide windows that looked out over a sprawling city of crystalline spires. But it was dead. There was no dust, no scuff marks on the floors, no smell of cooking or exhaust. It was a perfectly sanitized tomb. I can't wait to smell smog, Conrad whispered, pausing to catch his breath. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat coating his upper lip. I want to eat a greasy burger and breathe unfiltered, polluted air. Keep moving, Airy grunted, gritting his teeth as a sharp twinge fired in his lower back. If you stop, you'll lock up. They were escorted by a flank of 4 Ethel Guardian guards. The tall, mantis-like beings gave them a wide berth. They didn't point their energy rifles, but they held them at the ready. They looked at Airy not with malice, but with the cautious, repulsed wariness one might reserve for a rabid animal. The hangar was a vast, cavernous dome of white light. Sitting in the center of the polished floor was a rusted, blocky hunk of human engineering, a Class 4 short-haul freighter. It looked like a bruised thumb sticking out of of a white glove. The hull was scratched, the exhaust vents were scorched black, and the landing gear looked like it had been welded together in the dark. To Airy, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Standing at the base of the boarding ramp was Queen Eleanor. She stood absolutely motionless, a statue of liquid silver and translucent pearl against the backdrop of the battered human ship. The scale of the hangar made her look small, yet she commanded the space with a suffocating, atmospheric pressure. Airy stopped 10 feet away. He was breathing heavily, a wet, rattling sound in his chest. His knees were shaking. He didn't bow, he just stared at her. "The vessel's life support systems have been engaged," Eleanor stated. The translation matrix fed her acoustic trill directly into the hangar's overhead speakers, amplifying the synthesized voice. "Your navigational computer has been locked to a direct vector out of our territorial space. The jump drives will prime once you breach the outer ring." "Appreciate the lift," Ari said. He swallowed hard. His throat tasted like old pennies. Eleanor took a single step forward. The guards behind Ari immediately tensed, their crystalline armor clinking sharply. "I have spent the past rotational cycle analyzing the data the caretaker harvested from your biology," Eleanor said, her dark, fathomless eyes locked onto Ares' face. "Your cellular regeneration, your coagulants, the sheer, terrifying violence of your immune system. You are a species at war with yourselves at a microscopic level. Keeps us busy." "It makes you a contagion," she corrected. Her voice held no anger, only a cold, deeply unsettling dread. "We are built on harmony. We exist in a state of delicate pneumatic perfection. A single disruption ends us, but you absorb the disruption. You integrate the trauma. If we went to war with your kind, we might shatter 1,000 of your vessels. We might burn your flesh, but you would not stop. You would simply form a scab over your losses and keep advancing." Airy shifted his weight off his bad leg. The movement pulled at his scar, a dull, fiery reminder of his own mortality. He looked up at the towering alien sovereign. "You're giving us too much credit," Airy said, his voice dropping into a low, cynical rasp. "We aren't a plague. We're just stubborn. We don't want your perfect glass houses. We don't want your sterile air. We just want to get paid, get drunk, and die in our own beds at a ripe old age." He gestured vaguely at the rusted freighter behind her. "You shot us down because you were afraid we'd ruin the neighborhood. Next time, just hail us on the comms and tell us the toll is too high. We'll turn around. Nobody actually wants to fight." Eleanor stared at him for a long, silent eternity. The vast, empty hangar felt suddenly claustrophobic. "Board your vessel," Eleanor finally whispered. The speakers barely picked up the sound. Airy didn't wait to be told twice. He nodded once, a terse, jagged movement, and turned toward the ramp. The climb was the worst part. The grated metal of the incline bit through his thin, alien-spun shoes. He had to grab the rusted handrail with both hands, pulling his own dead weight upward while his abdominal wall screamed in protest. Behind him, Conrad dragged his calcified leg, cursing softly with every heavy clack of his crutch against the metal. Airy reached the top of the ramp and leaned heavily against the airlock doorframe. He was drenched in cold sweat. His vision swam with grey static. He turned around, looking down into the blinding white light of the hangar. Eleanor was still standing there. She looked completely alien, flawless, fragile, untouched by time or violence. Airy placed his hand over his stomach. He felt the thick, hard ridge of the scar through his shirt. It was ugly. It was tight. It was a permanent failure of his body's original design. But underneath that thick, chaotic weave of hardened flesh, his heart was beating. He drew in a deep, stuttering breath of recycled, stale ship air. It smelled like grease, old coffee, and ozone. It smelled like home. He slammed his hand against the console. The heavy hydraulic groan of the airlock door drowned out the silence of the alien world as it sealed shut, locking the monsters out and keeping the meat inside. Evolution didn't make humanity perfect. It made us stubborn. We don't shatter, we scar. If you loved this deep dive into the raw, gritty reality of HFY and want to see how Airy survives the Sovereign's terrifying curiosity, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss Part 4, where human resilience turns an alien empire upside down. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you were in Airy's shoes? Share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and stay tuned for more.